Philosophy Battle. The most entertaining presentation of philosophy you'll ever find on the internet, probably. Now entering the battlefield of philosophy of science, Philo-Sci. Kuhn, Logic of Discovery or Psychology of Research? I'm going to go over a piece where Thomas Kuhn compares his views with the views of Sir Karl Popper's. This will give us the ability to see the transition between falsification to paradigms and paradigm shifts. So, Thomas Kuhn starts out saying that he's going to compare his view from the structure of scientific revolutions with Sir Karl Popper's. I'm not as optimistic about confrontation as Sir Karl. Now, I don't know if Kuhn is actually making a comment, a funny little quip, because, falsification is confrontational in the sense that it confronts previous theories and refutes them, or if he's actually talking about Popper's personality. I don't really know Popper's personality. If you do, if you're a philosopher of science and you study Popper and if you know he's confrontational or not, then let me know in the comments below. Back to Kuhn. So he says he's not as optimistic about confrontation, and besides, he admires Sir Karl Popper's work, but it seems like he's going to have to compare their views anyway. He says, look, on almost all occasions, our views are nearly identical. We're both concerned with the process of science rather than its products. Both of us reject scientific growth by accretion, which is continual accumulation. Both emphasize instead the process of an older theory being rejected for a new incompatible one. Both underscore the role played when an older theory fails to meet challenges posed by the experiments. Finally, we're both against positivists and their claims to any neutral observation language. We're both well aware of how theory influences observation and vice versa. Now, Kuhn points to another similarity, but I'm gonna leave it because it introduces what I guess is treacherous grounds that Kuhn doesn't really want to get into, saying real objects, whatever the latter phrase may mean. But fret not, my allies, for these treacherous grounds is where I do battle in the philosophic battle of the field that is realism versus anti-realism. Okay, back to Kuhn. This list is big enough to place both of us in the same philosophic minority already. Apparently, many Popper fans read my work as a version of his work. Still, others focus on the ways I'm explicitly in disagreement with Popper. First, my emphasis on a commitment to tradition, and second, my discontent with the implication of the term falsification. Each group sees my work through their own perspective. Many Popper fans see how we agree, while non-Popperians don't see any agreement at all. It seems to me that those that see our disagreement are the ones that actually often recognize essential issues. But the way I see it, it's a Gestalt switch. What's striking in one perspective seems invisible in another, and this motivates my comparison. So what Kuhn wants to talk about is what's similar as a means to see it as two sides to the same coin, saying what demands attention are the places not where we disagree, but the central areas that we do agree. Well, that sort of failed now, didn't it, Kuhn? Because all we seem to talk about nowadays is how different they are. We both appeal to the same data, though our intentions are different when we say the same things. Reading over Popper's principal books, I encounter phrases I could never have used in the same places. True, those places are where he's just using metaphors or rhetorical devices that elsewhere he gives actual detailed descriptions for, but for our purposes, focusing on those metaphors may be more useful, and I have 4 places of that in mind. Look, we both agree on observing how science actually has been practiced, but it's because of that some of his generalizations really startled me. Then Thomas Kuhn cites one of Karl Popper's lines from The Logic of Scientific Discovery. A scientist, writes Sir Karl, whether theorist or experimenter, puts forward statements or system of statements and tests them step by step. In the field of empirical sciences, more particularly, he constructs hypotheses or system of hypotheses and tests them against experience by observation and experiment. This cliché statement presents 3 problems. First, it's ambiguous which sort of statements or theories are being tested. Second, it's true that ambiguousness is eliminated by passages elsewhere, but the resulting generalization is historically mistaken. 3. Not only is it historically mistaken, but the generalization doesn't capture how science can be distinguished from pseudoscience. Now, there is one sort of statements or hypotheses scientists do repeatedly test, which are individuals' best guesses about the way to connect his own research problem with the accepted scientific knowledge. For example, he may guess that the obesity of his lab rats is due to diet. Next, his research is intended to test his own guess. If it passes enough tests, the scientists at least resolve the puzzle. If not, they abandon the puzzle or come up with another hypothesis or another best guess. Tests of this sort is what I call normal science or normal research, and is the majority of work done in basic science. In no usual sense, though, are the tests direction to the current general theory. Instead, in normal science, the scientist must premise current theory as rules of the game. Current theory is required to define the puzzle and to guarantee that it can be solved. Only his personal conjecture is tested, and if his or her conjecture, their best guess, fails the test, it's their own ability, not the current general scientific theory, that's called into question. It is the individual scientist rather than the current theory which is tested. In Popper's view, though, he emphasizes those tests that subject current theory to its maximum strain. But those cases are actually really rare, and they are called forth by crisis or competing theories. These I call extraordinary research. Popper describes all of science in ways that only apply to occasional revolutionary parts of it. I know normal science is more boring than extraordinary research, but you can't understand science properly if you only looked at its revolutionary parts. Yes, testing of basic commitment occurs in extraordinary science, but it is normal science that discloses both the points to test and the manner of testing. My main point is that it's normal science where Popper's sort of risky testing doesn't occur rather than the extraordinary science that actually demarcates science. If a demarcation criterion exists, it's in the part that Karl Popper ignores. Then Kuhn points out that in one of Popper's essays, he traces this sort of process of claims and counterclaims and further claims as a means to progress in knowledge, much like Popper might be seeing theory, then falsification, then new theory as progressing in scientific knowledge, back to ancient Greek philosophers, philosophic debates from Tales to Plato, and critical discussion. But that doesn't resemble science at all. It characterizes philosophy. Then Kuhn claims by the Hellenistic period many fields abandoned that method in favor of what Kuhn keeps calling puzzle solving. Then Kuhn says, and I'm quoting here, "It is precisely the abandonment of critical discourse that makes a transition to a science. Once a field has made that transition, critical discourse recurs only at the moments of crisis. Only when they must choose between competing theories do scientists behave like philosophers." To kind of explain this in my words and my ideas, debate, critical discussion, argument, and counter-argument, this is what philosophers do. But one new kind of philosophy was so different it historically made efforts to rid itself the title as a kind of philosophy, i.e. science. And that was so because it's not about talking, it's about doing. And I want to say doing experiments, but in this case, as Kuhn is emphasizing, it is about doing puzzles. Puzzle solving, as he would say. Puzzle solving or doing experiments, though, only happens in normal science, where our main general theory sets up the rules for the puzzles, and while we're doing the puzzles, those rules aren't themselves questioned. Whereas philosophers in philosophic debate can question anything. There are no sacred cows, there are no dogmas. Doubt and argument can be made about anything, only perhaps governed by reason itself. But in special moments of extraordinary science, moments of crisis, when scientists are in doubt about different sets of rules, and therefore it's not the rules themselves, the scientific theories, that dictate which decision they can make, since at that period they themselves are possibly suspect, then scientists act like philosophers and use philosophic reasoning unrestricted by a specific scientific paradigm, which may include argumentation. Keep that in mind for later. When it comes to choosing, testing doesn't really play a decisive role. Puzzle solving can't happen unless the puzzle solvers share the same criteria that can say when the puzzle is solved for that group at that time. So it's the criteria that tells you if we fail to solve the puzzle. But whoever fails can view it as being the theory's failure. But normally it's not viewed that way. It's viewed as the practitioner's failure. though under special circumstances which we induce crisis by gross failure or repeated failure by the most brilliant professionals, the group's opinion may change. I want to note that gross failure or failures of the best aren't falsification. Failure isn't the same thing as falsification. This is something we see a lot in games we play, and it's the same in science. Lately, since new games are video games, they're produced so quickly it's actually a very familiar situation. Say you play a game and you fail to reach some goal, you get frustrated and say, "This game sucks anyway," or "It doesn't even make sense." At first, nobody's really going to take you seriously. Most humble players and other players, and certainly game developers, will simply consider that you suck. It's not the game, you just don't know how to play it properly, or you're not good at it. So the game itself isn't going to change just because one person is complaining. But say huge groups of people are failing, or the best of the best players are failing. That could be enough for the community to consider that it is the fault of the game. So again, imagine it's a video game. Imagine it's a new role-playing game. One where one of the quests, a selective quest, has a boss battle. One that you just can't beat no matter how hard you try. Whether you accept that you must be doing something wrong and seek help, or give up and move on to another quest, or even egoistically say that the game is broken if you can't beat that boss, none of that will actually directly make us reject the game and force the game developers to come up with a new game. But that failure does let you point it out to your friends, and say your friends can't beat that boss either, and none of their friends could beat that boss either, and they start an online group and it gains traction and no one can beat this boss. Wow, even the best players notice, so they try to beat that boss and they couldn't even do it. Then we as players and game developers will say, something is wrong here, and maybe it's not the players. But keep in mind, them thinking that doesn't necessarily mean the game has been falsified, just that they might lose favor of that game and might want to play a different one. Back to Kuhn. So after the group's opinion changes, what was thought of as a personal failure can seem to be the failure of a theory. Kuhn then goes on to say because the test arose from a puzzle, it proves more severe and harder to evade than tests available within a tradition whose normal science is critical discussion rather than puzzle solving. That's why severity and puzzle solving are two sides of the same coin. My interpretation of what he's saying here is just that because there's periods of just puzzle solving where the theory isn't questioned, that's what makes it comparatively severe when that theory is threatened, because the whole paradigm is threatened. That's why it may be called a scientific revolution, whereas in critical discussion of argument and counter-argument, simple back and forth of a theory, then falsified, then a new theory, there's nothing so severe or revolutionary in the fact that there's a counter-argument, especially when that's what we do normally. As I always say and emphasize, philosophers keep battling. This is why our lines of demarcation often coincide, but that they coincide is in their outcome. The process of applying them, though, is very different and isolates distinct aspects about demarcating what counts as science or non-science. For example, psychoanalysis and Marxist theory, which is what he initially designed his criteria for. Yes, I agree they aren't science, but I reached that conclusion surer and more direct. Out of testing and puzzle solving is less equivocal and more fundamental. Actually, to avoid controversies, I'm going to use what Popper often uses as clear cases of pseudoscience, astrology. He says they make things vague enough so that they can explain away anything. In order to escape falsification, they destroy testability of their theories. And that's kinda true in a way, but really, as the record shows, they've made many predictions that categorically failed. So it's not about how they predicted, but it's not about how they explained the failure for their prediction either. So I can imagine an astrologer explaining their failures by saying something like, oh, it's so immensely complex and it needs the most skill and it's extremely sensitive to even minor events and stars and planets' position are constantly changing. Oh, even the tables we are using aren't perfect computers. Hardly anyone provides us with sufficient data anyway of exactly when they're born, so no wonder predictions were off. As you see, they're trying to put blame anywhere they could, but keep it away from astrology itself, the idea that distant star formations do influence us. But Popper called this the conventionalist twist. They're getting all twisty. But, as Kuhn says, scientists use this twisty techniques too when explaining failure in medicine or meteorology. Now, he doesn't get into it and really explain that, but I'm going to try to give an example of those things of somebody in the medical profession and somebody doing meteorology, predicting the weather. We can imagine some medical professional saying there's too many factors and variables in each individual's body to guarantee that this medication will work for you. Not even the specialized doctor could guarantee that medication will work. There's so many environmental factors and dietary factors that could have adverse effects when used with these medications. We can't really put you in a controlled, observed environment as you live your life. It's darn near impossible to calculate exactly what will happen to any individual when we don't have proper enough medical history either, and so on. Or now a weatherman explaining why the weather prediction often enough fails. Again, there are so many complexities. That's why we give probable chance of rain rather than guarantees. Not even the best meteorologist is always going to be right. The global variables are always in flux. We don't even have the technology to capture sufficient information to even start making guarantees about next week, forget next month. But those two are sciences, Kuhn says. It's not just them, but even in the exact sciences, the hard sciences, like physics and chemistry and astronomy, they all do this. So it's neither how astrologers make the prediction, because they are sufficient to fail, nor how they explain away failure, since obviously other sciences do that kind of explanation anyway. It's neither of those two things that makes them unscientific. Nevertheless, astrology is not science. Astrologers do have particularly close parallels to old medicine or even modern meteorology. They did have some shared theory, but only insofar as to make it plausible and some kind of craft rules for practice. But no one believed they were sufficient to stop failure. Maybe they wanted better rules, but not having them wouldn't stop them from using what they do have, though without them, without better rules that allow for puzzle solving, they had no puzzles to solve and can't be considered a science. I would have liked Kuhn to go back specifically to the example of the meteorologist or the modern medical doctor to show how they do have puzzles and puzzles solved even if they seem as twisty as the astrologist, but he goes on to compare the astrologer with the astronomist. If the astronomist fails, we wonder why, and the calculations can be checked, and old observations can be re-examined. They take new measurements to figure out what happened. They try to realize why the failure occurred, and possibly that the theory might need adjustment. Astrologers, though, failures can be explained, but it didn't lead to any research puzzle. They didn't go on trying to figure out why they were wrong. Kuhn suggests here that for them, because there are far too many variables beyond knowledge, control, or responsibility, them not going to even try to figure out why they failed doesn't even make them look bad to their peers in their eyes. So it's to say they can explain failure without reflecting badly on themselves, or even the theory. In this way, it isn't accountable to the world, the empirical world, the world as we sense it. So in science, where we do puzzle solving, failure does happen. We blame the individual first, and we can go and try and figure out what they did wrong and what they didn't calculate or what factors they didn't take into consideration. But if gross failure happens, and many are retrying, or the best are trying, and they all still fail, this could induce crisis, where we might start blaming the theory instead of the individuals because there are just so many, or because they're just the best of the best. And for that reason, the group might fall out of favor of one theory and into favor of a competing theory. And this is the two sides of the coin I think Kuhn means in a sort of visual way. A kind of flip of the blame going from one side to another, going from normal science to extraordinary science. And back and forth. Coin continues to flip, and that's how progress is made. At least that's my visual take on it anyway. He says, and without puzzles able first to challenge and then to attest the ingenuity of the individual practitioner, astrology could not have become a science, even if the stars had in fact controlled human destiny. So actually, yes, astrologers' predictions were testable and fallible, and they admit they sometimes fail. But they don't react to or value that failure in the same way sciences normally do. So Popper's right to exclude it, but he's too focused on the revolutionary parts to see the surest reason for excluding it. Maybe this is why, despite Popper's emphasizing tests to replace theories, he's forced to admit it that they could be replaced without tests. For example, Ptolemaic theory. On some occasions, tests aren't necessary for scientific revolutions and advancement, but you can't say that about puzzle solving. You need that, since all the theories ceased to be adequate to support puzzle solving before they needed replacement. Then Kuhn cites some astronomers losing faith in Ptolemaic theory even as it was still the majority in faith by using ad hoc adjustments. Finally, Kuhn says, with or without tests, a puzzle-solving tradition can prepare the way for its displacement. To rely on testing as a mark of a science is to miss what scientists mostly do, and with it, the most characteristic feature of their enterprise. So here's one point of 2 points about Kuhn which I think are essential to grasp what's usually going on the battlefield when people drop that Kuhn. The first point of it being decently described here as Kuhn expresses his discontent with the implications of the term falsification. So I hope that even if I have gotten things wrong, misquoted, or misspoke, that my interpretation, paraphrasing, or the examples and visualizations I provided were at least sufficient to convey this first point. Falsification, as Karl Popper has it, doesn't really happen. No single experiment, not even if done by the best of the best, can one-time it. That is, can refute the theory. It's more that when many anomalies accumulate, that can kind of shake away a community's commitment or allegiance or assent or favor of one theory, making it possible to align with another. And yet we need not worry that we can't demarcate without falsification, because there's still Kuhn's puzzle solving, which could actually be a point of its own, but to be honest, I really don't personally witness the puzzle solving being used as a demarcation weapon in many battles. Listen, I still emphasize the importance of this weapon, falsification, because it's powerful, and powerful enough to swiftly cut someone out of a cult mentality, whether an Eastern mystical cult, or a religious cult, or a political ideological cult. So yes, I agree that one might still wield falsification against, let's say, more extreme cases of pseudoscience or pseudoscientific endorsers. But now if they were to try to drop Kuhn on us, we, since having an understanding of what Kuhn actually does say, could just respond by saying, oh yeah, if you're gonna drop Kuhn, we will use that exact drop to pull out the puzzle solving weapon and attack you, still demarcating you as non-science. But that seems to be a rare scenario, and maybe because if the enemy were into philosci enough to drop Kuhn to respond to us, they might not have been in a cult-like position where we would feel the need to wield falsification to save them in the first place. Still, I stand by what I said before. Wielding falsification against unsophisticated dogmatics is one thing, but against philosophers and philosophy today, we'll smack it out your hand and do so carelessly. Kuhn. Listen, that carelessly part of my phrasing is a kind of reflection of how unsophisticated and naive Popper's falsification would be taken as we have moved from positivism to postmodernism, which is somewhat, perhaps poorly, but still depicted in those stages I presented to understanding science earlier. Now I'll get into this spectrum later, what it means and how it is seen in many different places. It doesn't have to be looked at as temporal either. There are criticisms on both sides, but part of that criticism would fall onto looking at falsification almost as if it were as naive as positivism itself. But for now, what if I told you a philosopher could combine Kuhn's paradigms with Popper's falsification and forge a new super weapon called super falsification? Okay, it's called sophisticated falsification, not super falsification, but anyway, would you like to hear about that maybe? You wanna know how that's possible? Well, too bad. We gotta talk about the second point to understanding what's happening when people drop Kuhn, which is now mainly to summon the gates of hell, pouring in enemies down onto the battlefield of Philosophy wielding dangerous weapons, all going around like, oh, Kuhn, yeah, Kuhn, messing up science advocates everywhere left and right, and Kuhn's all like, oh, snack. I didn't want this to happen. So he slaps together some junk like, well, maybe this will close the gate. Let's just put it right here. Is it closing the gate? And, people are just around like, hey, you do know that these weapons we're using, these dangerous weapons, are stronger than the patch, right? And he's like, yeah, I know. So enemies keep flying through the gate, dropping Kuhn to get into that Philosophy with their dangerous weapon. And it's at this point, I believe, Kuhn cries out, I'm not a Kuhnian. Only then will you see the use and need and power of upgrading falsification. Only then will you appreciate this new weapon. But who are these enemies? How exactly does Kuhn's paradigm summon these gates? And what is this dangerous weapon that I keep making a big deal about? All that in a bag of chips in the next episode. I'm kidding. That's just a joke. The truth is, I'll probably have eaten the chips by the next episode. Funding. I need funding. Some of my videos take 90 plus hours, and if you take that 90 and you plus hours, that's a lot of time. I can't just churn out these kind of videos with little effort like a React video or an ASMR video or stealing clips of other people's works, cartoons, or just reading comments off the internet. So obviously I don't have a lot of videos or a huge fan base. I'm new, and I don't know if you know this, but YouTube doesn't reward or make it easy for unestablished high quality production YouTubers. If anything, they make it way harder, especially on shows like mine. So if you think I deserve to exist here and I deserve some support, I humbly request that you, yes you, actually log into your Google account and subscribe to my channel, watch my videos, and actually share my videos. Now if you're thinking, oh, the internet has millions of people online and surely someone else can do it, someone else can support this guy, I'm sure a lot of people will do it eventually. Well, guess what? They won't. And I need and want it to be you to join me on this hardcore awesome philosophical journey. But the best way to ensure the journey continues even without bajillions of subs is by supporting me on Patreon. A few of the dollars you might have spent on garbage food could instead really help fund this production and ensure I keep making more videos on philosophical battles that you're just gonna love so much. While all my early subscribers are special and will be noticed by me definitely, my Patreon supporters will get special rewards, not just shoutouts, but even influence on the direction of the philosophical path itself. Not just in the philosophy, but also in other battlefields as well. So believe me, for a small YouTuber like me, it makes a big difference. I definitely will notice, and you will be actually contributing in a meaningful way. Thanks.